37 years. That is how long the doors had been sealed. 37 years since any sitting pope had crossed that threshold, since any voice carrying the weight of Rome had spoken inside those walls. 2 billion Catholics around the world, one man. And the moment that stopped everyone, the moment that made the cameras freeze and the crowd fall silent, was not a speech. It was not a decree. It was the look on his face when he walked in, took off his white zucchetto, and sat down on a plain wooden chair among the people everyone else had walked past. That is where this begins. The decision came quietly. It always does with Leo XIV. There was no press conference, no Vatican bulletin circulating through the diplomatic channels 24 hours in advance. The word reached the local coordinators in the early morning, hours before the scheduled visit, carried through a single phone call from the Secretariat of State. The Holy Father wished to alter the day's itinerary. He would not be making only the ceremonial stop at the Civic Hall. He was going somewhere else first, somewhere that had not been on any official schedule. Somewhere, several people noted later, that most senior Vatican officials had privately hoped would remain off the agenda entirely. What followed over the next 6 hours would be talked about for months. Not because of what was announced, not because of any document signed or any policy changed, but because of what one man chose to do with his body, with his time, with his silence, in a place the world had largely agreed to forget. To understand why it mattered, it is necessary to go back, not decades, but to a specific conversation that took place inside the Domus Sancti Marthi in the spring of this year. Leo XIV had been reading a report, not a diplomatic briefing, not a curial memorandum, a pastoral report filed by a small team of Augustinian missionaries working in one of the most isolated corners of the region. The report described a facility. Its name is not important here. What matters is what the report said about it. It described a place that had once been visited by a cardinal legate in 1988, a place that had received a formal letter of fraternal solidarity from the Holy See in 2003, and a place that had received nothing, not a letter, not a representative, not a phone call, in the 23 years since. The report noted, with the kind of careful ecclesiastical understatement that conceals tremendous pain, that the people inside that facility had begun to wonder whether they had been forgotten by God or simply by God's representatives on earth. The missionary team was not sure which possibility was more devastating to the people they served. Leo XIV read the report twice. He set it down. He picked up a pen and wrote 2 words in the margin. I go. No one who knows this pope was surprised. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the man from Buenos Aires who became Francis, had already broken so many of those invisible cordons, the unspoken agreements about where a pope does and does not appear. Leo XIV had studied that papacy carefully. But Leo XIV is a different temperament. Where Francis moved quickly and publicly, Leo XIV moves slowly and often silently. He is a man who, by several accounts from those who have worked closely with him, prefers to act first and explain later, if he explains at all. His theology is quieter than his predecessors, but no less radical. What Francis announced, Leo XIV often simply does. And so, on a Tuesday morning that had begun with a routine series of bilateral meetings and a blessing at the city's main cathedral, the motorcade turned. The route changed. The police outriders received new coordinates, and for the first time in 37 years, a Roman pontiff moved through the gates of a place that had become, in the collective imagination of the church's comfortable center, a symbol of everything too difficult to look at directly. What the facility actually is depends on who is telling the story. In the official municipal language, it is a residential care and rehabilitation institution for individuals with severe and complex needs, a phrase that, translated into plain human reality, means that the people who live there have nowhere else to go. Some arrived as children, some will never leave. The staff work in difficult conditions, not because the administration is cruel, by most accounts it is not, but because the weight of the work, the depth of the need, and the scarcity of resources create a kind of permanent exhaustion that no management strategy has ever fully solved. The chaplain who has served there for 11 years, a quiet Franciscan friar named Brother Tomas, had submitted 3 requests to the local diocese over the past decade asking for additional pastoral support. He received 2 acknowledgments and one extended silence. Brother Tomas was standing near the entrance when the vehicles arrived. He didn't know they were coming. The advance team, operating under strict instructions, had contacted only the facility director and only 1 hour before. Brother Tomas found out when a staff member ran to find him in the garden where he was conducting a small outdoor prayer group with 6 residents who were well enough to sit outside. The staff member was out of breath. "The Pope," she said. That was the complete sentence. What happened over the next 3 hours has been reconstructed from accounts given by Brother Tomas, the facility director, 4 members of staff, and 2 residents who have since spoken to journalists with the permission of their guardians. The picture that emerges is not the picture that a Vatican communications office would have designed. There was no formal program. There were no prepared remarks delivered to a gathered audience. There was no ribbon, no plaque, no photograph taken in front of a banner bearing the papal coat of arms. There was, instead, a man in white walking slowly through a building that smelled of antiseptic and old carpet and the particular staleness of rooms that are cleaned but never quite aired, stopping at every door that was open, looking in, and whenever someone looked back at him, stepping inside. The first room he entered belonged to a woman named Marguerite. She is 81 years old. She has lived in the facility for 14 years. She has a daughter who visits twice a year, at Christmas and at Easter, and who sends a card on her birthday. She is not, by the facility's clinical taxonomy, one of the residents with the most complex needs, but she is one of the loneliest. The staff know this. They try. There are not enough hours. When Leo XIV stepped through her doorway, Marguerite was sitting in a chair by the window looking at the street below, as she does most mornings, as she has done for 14 years. She did not stand up. She could not easily stand up. She looked at him. He looked at her. He crossed the room, pulled a chair from beside her small table, sat down directly beside her, and asked her what she could see from the window. Not, "How are you feeling?" Not, "God bless you." What she could see from the window. She told him. A supermarket, a bus stop, a tree that had grown since she arrived and was now blocking the left side of the view, a bicycle that someone had locked to the railing 3 weeks ago and had never come back for. He listened. He did not check his watch. He did not glance toward the door where his secretary was standing. He sat with her for 11 minutes. When he left, he held both of her hands in both of his for a moment, and he said something to her quietly. No microphone was close enough to record it. Marguerite told a staff member afterward what he had said. The staff member, who later spoke with tears in her voice, related in the simplest possible terms. He told her that God had not forgotten her address. That line, which was never part of any speech, which appeared in no prepared text, which emerged from a spontaneous private exchange between an old woman and the Bishop of Rome in a room where a supermarket and a bicycle were the news of the world, that line traveled. It was repeated first by the staff member to the facility director. The facility director mentioned it to a journalist that evening, attributing it only to someone present at the visit. By the next morning, it had been picked up by 3 Catholic news services and was being shared across social media platforms in 17 languages. By that evening, a Ghanaian priest had quoted it in a homily. A Brazilian theologian had written a short reflection on its significance. A grandmother in the Philippines had it printed on a card and placed in her prayer book. God had not forgotten her address. Leo XIV was not performing. That is the essential thing to understand about this moment and about this pontificate. There is a category of papal gesture that functions as theater, beautiful, sincere theater. Perhaps. But theater nonetheless, the dramatic visit to the periphery, the unexpected embrace, the symbolic break with protocol. These gestures matter. They communicate something real, but they are designed to communicate. They are constructed for the image, even when the image represents genuine conviction. What distinguishes this pope, and what makes those who cover him most carefully both admiring and slightly off balance, is that his gestures do not appear to be constructed for observation. They appear to be constructed for the person in front of him. The cameras are incidental. The record is incidental. Marguerite at her window is not incidental. She is the point. He moved through the facility for 3 hours. He sat with a young man who had not spoken to anyone outside the immediate staff in 4 months, and who, according to Brother Tomas, became visibly calmer in the presence of the Pope without either of them exchanging a single word. They simply sat together listening to music playing from a small speaker in the corner of the room. He stood in the facility's small chapel, which seats 30 people and has a water stain on the ceiling above the altar that has been there since 2019, and he spent 20 minutes there alone. No one knows what he did during those 20 minutes. Brother Tomas waited outside. When Leo XIV emerged, he looked at the water stain on the ceiling, looked at Brother Tomas, and said that someone should fix that. It was the kind of thing a pastor says, not a pope. Brother Tomas laughed despite himself. The repair request, which had been submitted to the facility's management office 4 times over 6 years, was actioned the following week. It was in the dining hall that the moment occurred which those who were present have most struggled to describe. The midday meal was already underway when Leo XIV walked in. The residents who were mobile enough to be in the dining hall, approximately 40 people, were eating. Some looked up. Some did not. The staff froze in the way that people freeze when an unexpected thing of enormous weight appears in an ordinary room. Leo XIV walked to an empty seat at one of the long tables, sat down, and asked the resident beside him if he could share his bread. The resident, a man in his 50s named Pavel, who arrived at the facility 7 years ago and who struggles significantly with social interaction, handed him a piece of bread without looking up from his own plate. Leo XIV thanked him. He ate the bread. He stayed at the table for the rest of the meal. He did not sit at a separate place of honor. He did not receive a special plate. He ate what was being served, a bowl of vegetable soup, bread, and a small portion of rice pudding. The Vatican press pool, which had been kept outside the building until that point, was not permitted inside the dining hall. The photograph that exists from that meal was taken on a staff member's phone from the far end of the room and is slightly blurred. In the image, a man in white is barely distinguishable from the other figures at the table. It is an imperfect image. It is one of the most important images of this pontificate. The theological resonance of what he did in that dining hall did not need to be explained to anyone who has read the Gospels with any attention. The act of table fellowship, sitting with, eating with, being counted among, is not incidental to the Christian story. It is structural to it. Leo XIV was not making a speech about the dignity of the marginalized. He was not releasing a document on the pastoral care of those with complex needs. He was doing the thing that the tradition he leads says is the most profound act available to a human being. He was eating with someone. He was saying, with his body, that this table is not a lesser table, that these people are not lesser people, that the church does not observe from a respectful distance, that the church sits down. After the meal, he asked to meet with the staff, not the administrative staff. He asked for whoever had been on shift since the previous evening. 12 people came into the small conference room, some still in their work clothes, some having come in from other parts of the building. He thanked them. He did not do so in a sweeping, formal way. He went around the room and asked each of them their name and how long they had been working there. He asked a woman named Sylvie, who had been there for 19 years, what had kept her. She told him that when she started, she had intended to stay for 1 year, and that after the first year she could not leave because she had become too attached to the people in her care, and that after 5 years she had understood that this was not a temporary posting but a vocation, and that she had stopped thinking of it as work she did for other people, and had begun thinking of it as work she did with other people, and that this distinction, small as it might sound, had changed everything for her. Leo XIV listened to all of this. Then he said, and this was later confirmed by 3 people in the room who wrote it down separately and whose versions are consistent, that what Sylvie had described was a more complete theology of service than anything he had read in a textbook. He said that the church had a great deal to learn from people like her, and that the problem was not that such people were absent from the church, but that the church had not always been paying sufficient attention to the rooms where they were working. He did not stop there. Something in that room, something in the collective exhaustion and quiet dignity of the 12 people sitting across from him, moved him to stay longer than any advisor would have scheduled. He asked a man named Christophe, who had been working night shifts for 3 years, who had 2 children at home, and who had the particular hollowed-out alertness of someone who had not slept properly in a very long time, whether the work ever became too heavy to carry. Christophe was quiet for a moment. Then he said that there were nights when it did, and that on those nights he went to the chapel at the end of the corridor and sat in the dark for a few minutes before his next round, and that he was not sure whether what he felt in those minutes was prayer or simply the absence of noise, but that either way, it helped him to go back. Leo XIV nodded. He told Christophe that the distinction Christophe was unsure about between prayer and the absence of noise was one that the greatest mystics in the Church's history had also been unsure about, and that his uncertainty placed him in very good company. Several people in the room laughed. Christophe looked at the floor and smiled the smile of a man who has been seen by someone he did not expect to see him. Before he left the conference room, Leo XIV asked Brother Tomas one more question. He asked how many of the residents in the facility had family who visited regularly. Brother Tomas said that roughly a third received regular visits, another third received occasional visits, and the remaining third received almost none. Leo XIV was quiet for a moment. Then he asked Brother Tomas to send him, personally through the appropriate channels, a list of the residents who received no visits at all. Not their medical files, not their case histories, just their names and their birthdays. Brother Tomas said he would. The list, when it was compiled, contained 41 names. What happened to that list after it arrived in the Vatican, whether it became the seat of a new program, a personal correspondence, a directive to local dioceses, has not been publicly confirmed. What is known is that the list was received because Brother Tomas received an acknowledgement, handwritten, within the week. He left the facility at 3:47 in the afternoon. He had been scheduled to leave at 2. The civic dinner that had been arranged for that evening was not canceled, but it was shortened. 3 subsequent meetings in the day's schedule were moved to the following morning. No official statement about the visit was released by the Vatican that day. The Vatican press office, when asked by reporters, said only that the Holy Father had made a pastoral visit to a residential care facility and that further details would be available in the morning. The further details, when they came, were sparse. A brief paragraph in the daily Vatican bulletin, a photograph, not the blurred dining hall image, which the Vatican did not use, but one taken in the corridor, showing Leo XIV in conversation with Brother Tomas. Both of them turned slightly toward each other in the way of two men who are actually talking rather than posing. No quotes were attributed to the Pope, no thematic statement was issued, no policy announcement followed. The Vatican's silence on this visit was not, according to those who understand the internal culture of the current pontificate, an oversight. It was a choice. There is a school of thought within Leo XIV's inner circle, a small, theologically serious group of advisors who have followed him from his earlier work, that holds that the greatest pastoral gestures are diminished by institutional narration. That to issue a statement about a visit is to make the visit about the statement. That to frame an act of solidarity in the language of papal teaching is to convert a human encounter into a lesson, and that the conversion, however well-intentioned, costs something real. The visit to the facility was designed to be what it was. It was not designed to be a document about what it was. And yet the absence of an official voice did not produce silence. It produced instead the particular kind of attention that institutional silence often generates. The attention of people filling in the space themselves, from their own experience, with their own meaning. Brother Tomas wrote about the visit on a small Catholic blog that he maintains irregularly and that had, before that day, approximately 300 regular readers. His account was simple, personal, and written in the voice of a man who had been surprised. He described the Pope sitting in Marguerite's room. He described the dining hall. He described the water stain. He described his own laughter. He did not theologize. He did not interpret. He simply said what he saw, and he said that what he saw had restored something in him that he had not been aware was diminished. The post was shared 40,000 times in 48 hours. The response from ordinary Catholics, not theologians, not journalists, not Vatican observers, but people who go to Mass on Sunday, and who have elderly relatives in care homes, and who have their own complicated feelings about whether the Church truly shows up for the people it claims to serve, was remarkable in its uniformity. The word that appeared most often in comments and messages and emails sent to Brother Tomas's inbox and to the facility's front desk was not inspiring or historic or prophetic. The word was thank you. Thank you for going. Thank you for sitting down. Thank you for the bread. Thank you for asking about the bicycle. That response, its texture, its specificity, its emotional register, revealed something important about the moment this pontificate is operating within. There is a generation of Catholics and a generation of people adjacent to Catholicism without quite belonging to it, who are not asking the Church for better arguments. They are not asking for more sophisticated theology. They have lived through enough institutional failure, enough carefully worded apology, enough commission report and reform agenda to be largely unmoved by the Church's official voice speaking in its official register. What moves them is different. What moves them is a man pulling a chair across a room. What moves them is bread passed without eye contact at a table where nobody expected a pope to sit. What moves them is the news, arriving through a blurred photograph taken on a staff member's phone, that someone went. This is not anti-intellectual. It is, if anything, the opposite. It is the recognition that the most demanding theological claim the Church makes, that God took on flesh, that the infinite became particular, that the Word was made not concept but body, is either demonstrated in flesh and body, or it is not demonstrated at all. Leo XIV, whether by instinct or formation or both, appears to understand this with unusual clarity. The visit to the facility was not a departure from doctrine. It was doctrine in its most unmediated form. It was the incarnation, reenacted on a Tuesday afternoon in a building with old carpet and a water stain, by a man who asked an old woman what she could see from her window and then listened to the answer. And then something happened that no one had anticipated, and which illustrated, perhaps better than anything else, the strange and unpredictable way in which this papacy tends to move. It is worth pausing here, before describing what came next, to note something about the nature of institutional memory. Large institutions, and the Catholic Church is among the largest and oldest institutions in human history, have a tendency to remember their own official acts. They archive the encyclicals, they preserve the synod minutes, they photograph the signing ceremonies and the diplomatic receptions, and the moments when two men in formal dress shake hands across a table that has been polished for the occasion. What institutions tend not to archive, because the archiving mechanism was never designed for it, is the texture of the unofficial moment. The 11 minutes in a room by a window, the bread passed without ceremony, the laughter in a corridor over a water stain. These moments do not enter the official record. They enter a different kind of record. They enter the memory of the people who were present and the stories those people tell, and the ways that those stories quietly change the shape of what the people who hear them believe is possible. That is the record that matters most, and it is the record that Leo XIV appears, more than any calculation, to be actually writing. 3 weeks after the visit, a letter arrived at the facility. It was not from the Secretariat of State. It was not from the Pontifical Council for the Pastoral Care of the Sick. It was not from any curial department. It was addressed in a plain envelope to Brother Thomas. By name, with no return address printed on the outside, only a Vatican City postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in Italian, brief enough to read in under a minute. It thanked Brother Thomas for his care over 11 years. It said that the chapel with the water stain was one of the most genuinely prayerful spaces the writer had been inside in a long time. It noted that the outdoor prayer group in the garden, the one that had been interrupted by the unexpected arrival, was exactly the kind of pastoral creativity that the Church needed more of and less credit for. And at the bottom, it was signed simply with 2 initials and a small cross. Brother Thomas, who has spent 11 years in a facility where dramatic things rarely happen, sat with the letter for a long time before he showed it to anyone. When he did finally show it, he showed it to Sylvie, who had been there 19 years and who knew what to do with things that arrived unexpectedly and meant more than their size suggested. She read it. She handed it back. She went back to her work. That evening, she mentioned it to Christophe during the shift handover. Christophe said nothing. He went to the chapel at the end of the corridor. He sat in the dark for a few minutes. Whether it was prayer or the absence of noise, it helped him to go back. Because this is what the visit ultimately communicated in a language that required no translation and no theological formation to understand, that the person in the difficult room is not a problem to be administered, that the person at the table is not a category to be served, that the person by the window, watching the supermarket and the bus stop and the tree that has grown and the bicycle that was left, that person is a person, particular and unrepeatable, whose address is known by the one who made them and whose address is known now by the one who came. There are pontificates remembered for their documents, their councils, their geopolitical interventions, their theological controversies. There are pontificates remembered for their gestures. The distinction matters less than it might appear to. The documents of the greatest popes have always been, at their best, the written form of what those popes already were when no one was writing anything down. The gesture is the theology. The chair pulled across the room is the encyclical in its most concentrated form. Leo XIV had not set out that morning to make history. He had set out, as he does most mornings, to do what seemed most necessary. The 37 years of sealed doors, the 3 submitted requests for pastoral support, the water stain above the chapel altar, the 41 names with no visitor on their record, the residents who had begun to wonder, all of this was, in the logic that governs this papacy, sufficient reason. More than sufficient. It was a reason that admitted no delay. The night after the visit, a staff member who had been present in the dining hall when Leo XIV ate his soup and his bread and his small portion of rice pudding wrote a single sentence in her personal journal. She did not publish it. She shared it months later in an interview when asked what the visit had meant to her. The sentence was this: "Today, someone came who did not have to come and stayed longer than he was supposed to and asked our names." That is what the Vatican speechless means. Not that the institution was silenced by scandal or embarrassed by controversy. It means that there are moments when the language of institutions, with all its precision and its dignity and its long memory, does not have words adequate to what a single human being has just done. It means that the press office paragraph and the bulletin entry and the diplomatic photograph in the corridor are all true and all insufficient, because what happened in that facility on that Tuesday afternoon belongs to a register of human action that institutional language was not built to hold. History, in the end, is not always made in the chambers where history is supposed to be made. Sometimes it is made in a room with old carpet and an imperfect window view, by 2 people sitting beside each other saying nothing of consequence to anyone except themselves, which is to say, saying everything. Sometimes it is made by a piece of bread passed without ceremony between a man who does not know who is sitting next to him and a man who came precisely because he knew. Sometimes it is made by 41 names on a list and a handwritten letter with 2 initials and a small cross and a chapel at the end of a corridor where a man sits in the dark before going back. God had not forgotten her address. And for one Tuesday afternoon, and then for 3 weeks later in a plain envelope with a Vatican City postmark, neither had the Church. For more on Pope Leo XIV's pontificate, the moments the headlines miss, the decisions behind the decisions, the faith in motion, subscribing ensures nothing is missed as this story continues to unfold. And if one moment from this visit stayed with you longer than the others, the comments are there for exactly that reason. God bless.